My name is Evelyn Carter, and at 45, I never thought I'd be standing at the crossroads of my life, looking back at everything I thought I knew and deciding what came next. It all started on a quiet autumn morning, just 3 weeks after I lost David, my husband of 20 years. The grief was still fresh, like a wound that hadn't yet scabbed over. The house, once filled with the hum of our daily routines, now felt empty, echoing with the silence of his absence. I couldn't even remember the last time I had laughed or felt anything but the crushing weight of loss. It was early, and the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds when I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom, pulling my favorite black dress over my head. It was the one David had bought me on our 10th anniversary, and even now, after everything, it still carried the memory of his smile as he handed it to me with a kiss. The thought of him, so vibrant and alive only a few weeks ago, hit me like a ton of bricks. I stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection. No makeup, no pretense, just the reality of what I had become. A widow. A widow at 45, feeling more alone than I ever thought possible. I had imagined the day would come, of course, but never like this. Never so soon. I finished dressing and went downstairs, the weight of each step feeling heavier than the last. The house felt different now. The walls, which had always been a quiet comfort, felt as if they were closing in on me. Every room, every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall, everything felt like a reminder of what was gone. I made coffee in David's favorite mug, out of habit, before I realized what I had done. I poured it out and stood there for a moment, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain, wondering how I was supposed to go on without him. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m., and I knew who it was before I even answered. Peter, my son, had always been punctual, ever since he was a child. At 23, Peter had grown into a man, someone I barely recognized at times. He was standing at the door in a dark suit, his expression tight and serious. Behind him stood Julia, his wife, looking polished and perfectly put together as always. They were both dressed as if attending a funeral, and I suppose in a way we all were. "Mom?" Peter said, stepping forward to hug me, though the embrace was stiff. "How are you holding up?" I pulled away, forcing a smile, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "I'm managing," I said, though the words didn't come out quite as smoothly as I'd hoped. Julia, standing slightly behind Peter, leaned in to kiss my cheek. "Evelyn, you look tired," she said, her voice dripping with that concern that always seemed to come with an undertone of something else, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Are you sleeping well?" "Well enough," I replied, brushing it off. I had never been one to show weakness, even to my own family. We drove to the funeral home in Peter's car, a black sedan that always looked too new for his age. I sat in the back, staring out the window at the streets of our small town, watching the familiar landmarks pass by, the diner where David and I had our first date, the park where Peter had learned to ride his bike, the church where we'd been married. Everything felt so ordinary, yet now it seemed like a distant memory. The funeral service was simple but dignified. David had never been one for grand displays, and I knew he would have appreciated the small, intimate gathering of close friends and family. Reverend Mason spoke kind words about David's contributions to the community and his dedication to our family. But as I sat there, listening, I felt like I was trapped in a fog. Everything seemed distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. After the service, Peter and Julia suggested we go to lunch, but I couldn't stomach the idea of sitting in a crowded restaurant, pretending that everything was okay. So we drove back to the house, and they stayed for a while, making small talk, as if trying to fill the silence with anything that might distract me from the obvious grief that hung in the air. As they ate, I started to feel the familiar tension that always existed between us. Peter, with his perfectly tailored suits and his successful career as a lawyer, had a way of carrying himself that made me feel small. He never meant to, but his polished demeanor always made me feel like I was stuck in a past that no longer mattered to him. Julia, with her carefully manicured appearance and constant smile, never seemed to let anything disrupt her vision of perfection. I could see through it, though. Beneath the surface, there was something sharp about her, something calculating. She had always treated me with kindness, but there was a certain calculating nature that unsettled me, even when she was being sweet. "Mom," Peter said, breaking my reverie, "Julia and I have been talking, and we think it might be a good idea for you to consider moving. I mean, this house is too much for you to handle alone, especially now that Dad's gone." I felt a wave of unease wash over me, and Julia nodded in agreement. "We've been looking at some places, assisted living communities, safe, comfortable places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining the house, dealing with repairs, or cooking every day. You deserve some peace of mind, Evelyn." Their words hung in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about my peace of mind at all. This was about control. Control over my life, my home, and my future. I hadn't even had time to grieve properly, and already they were making plans for me. Plans I hadn't asked for and didn't want. "I've been managing just fine for 45 years, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "David and I raised Peter here. We built this life together, and I'm not ready to let it go. Not yet." Peter didn't respond immediately, but I could see the frustration building in his eyes. Julia, ever the diplomat, smiled politely, but I could tell she didn't understand. "Let's talk about this more when you're ready," Peter said, his voice softer now, though I could still hear the edge in it. As they left, I stood in the doorway, watching them drive off. A part of me knew they were only trying to help, but I also knew there was something beneath their concern that I wasn't quite ready to face. The house, this life, had been David's and mine. And while it felt like a weight on my shoulders, it was still my life, and I wasn't ready to let go of it. Not yet. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I realized something that shook me to my core. This wasn't just about losing David, it was about losing control. The house, the life we had built, my independence, it was all slowly slipping away, and I didn't know how to hold on to it anymore. I looked around the room, at the books, the pictures, the memories, and I knew something had to change. I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. But the question was, how do I keep living when everything I knew is suddenly gone? It was a few days after Peter and Julia left that the weight of their visit truly hit me. The house felt colder, emptier, as though their words had seeped into the walls. The thought of moving, of leaving behind the place that held decades of memories, made my chest tighten. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But I also couldn't deny the part of me that felt a little scared, a little unsure of what the future held now that David was gone. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions, as if my body was moving without my mind fully participating. I started sorting through David's things, his clothes, his books, his tools. Each item felt like a small betrayal, but I knew I couldn't leave it all untouched. There were boxes of old letters in the attic, photographs of our travels, and even receipts from the first car we bought together. I didn't know what to do with it all. It was like holding on to these pieces of him meant I could somehow keep him alive, but at the same time, it felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the past. That's when the phone call came. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers from the funeral, when my phone buzzed. The caller ID read Ben Marks, David's lawyer. I had almost forgotten about the meeting he had mentioned before, but when I picked up the phone, I felt a strange knot form in my stomach. "Evelyn, it's Ben," he said, his voice warm but steady. "I hope you're holding up okay. I wanted to follow up on our meeting about David's estate. I know this is a lot to process, but I think it's important that we go over some details. I can come by if that's easier for you." The knot in my stomach tightened. Ben had been David's trusted advisor for years, and I respected him. But there was something about the way he said those words, "It's important that we go over some details," that made me feel uneasy. "I'll come to your office tomorrow," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I'm ready." The next morning, I drove to Ben's office, the familiar streets of our small town feeling almost surreal. It was as if I was on autopilot, going through the motions of a life that didn't feel like my own anymore. When I arrived at Ben's office, a small, cozy building tucked between the town's diner and the post office, I felt the familiar pang of anxiety. This was where David had always handled things, and now I was here alone, ready to face whatever secrets had been hidden from me. Ben greeted me with his usual warm smile, his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed. He led me into a quiet room in the back of the office, where a leather chair sat across from his desk. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, my hands trembling slightly as I set my purse on the floor beside me. "I know this is hard, Evelyn," he said as he opened a file on his desk. "But David made sure you'd be taken care of. He knew you might face some tough decisions after he was gone, and he wanted you to be prepared." He handed me a thick folder, its contents spilling over with documents. There were bank statements, investment records, property deeds, and something that looked like a will. But as I started flipping through the papers, one document caught my eye. It was a letter addressed to me in David's handwriting. "David wrote you a letter," Ben said, his voice quiet now. "He wanted you to have it when the time was right." I felt my heart race as I opened the letter, my hands unsteady. The words David had written were familiar, but they hit me with a force I hadn't expected. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, then I am no longer with you. I know this will be hard for you, but I also know that you are stronger than you realize. Over the years, I've watched you navigate challenges with grace and resilience. I've always admired that about you, but I also know that, at times, you've put others first, me, Peter, and the world around you. I'm writing this letter because I need you to understand something. Peter is not the person we once knew. I've seen changes in him that you haven't yet noticed, and I'm afraid that when I'm gone, he will try to take control of your life, of our home, of the wealth we've built together. He doesn't see you as an equal partner anymore. He sees you as someone to be managed, someone whose future he can plan for. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, but to prepare you. You are not helpless, Evelyn. You are capable, strong, and more than capable of handling this on your own. I've left you the means to live independently, to continue the life we started. Please don't let anyone take that from you. You are my partner, my equal, and I trust you to make the decisions that are right for you. Love always, David." I put the letter down slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of David's words felt like a wave crashing over me, overwhelming in its simplicity and truth. He had known. He had known what Peter might try to do, and he had set everything in motion to protect me. David's foresight and love had secured my future, but the realization of what that meant hit me hard. I looked up at Ben, who was watching me closely, waiting for my reaction. "David was clear about his wishes," Ben said softly, "and he made sure everything was in place. There's no need to make decisions hastily. But you should know, Evelyn, David was a very successful man. His business, the investments, he didn't just leave you a comfortable life, he left you something that will last, something that will allow you to live on your terms." I felt a sense of disbelief wash over me. David had been careful, so careful in providing for me, in ensuring that I wouldn't just survive after his death, but thrive. But as I sat there in Ben's office, a strange mix of gratitude and fear gripped me. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my husband. I was mourning the loss of control over my own life. And it wasn't just Peter I had to protect myself from. It was the entire world that suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. That evening, after I returned home, I sat down in the living room, the same armchair where David and I had spent countless nights together. I looked around the room, at the photographs of us, at the small trinkets from our travels, and realized something. David had always been there to protect me, but now I was going to have to protect myself. I wasn't ready to let go of this house, of the life we'd built, but the world had changed, and so had I. I wasn't helpless. I never had been. And now, with David's trust, I was going to prove it. In the days that followed my meeting with Ben, the reality of what I had just learned began to settle in like a heavy fog. David had always been the one to handle the finances, the decisions, the big picture stuff that kept our lives running smoothly. I had never thought much about the details. It was his role, and I was content to let him take care of it. But now, as I sat in the house we had built together, surrounded by the life we had crafted, I realized that those roles had changed. I was in control now. I had the power to decide what came next. The first thing I did was take inventory. I went through the papers Ben had given me, reading each document carefully, making sure I understood everything. It was almost overwhelming, the sheer magnitude of what David had left me. There were multiple accounts, real estate investments, life insurance policies, and even stocks in companies I'd never heard of. David had made sure I was taken care of, not just in the short term, but for the long haul. I couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and disbelief. My husband had known. He had known what I would face after his death, what my son Peter would try to do, and he had prepared for it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even upset, at least, not at first. But as the days wore on, a sense of betrayal began to creep in. Peter had always been independent, a go-getter, but lately I had seen a change in him. His wife, Julia, was an ambitious woman, always striving for more, and I suspected that some of that ambition had rubbed off on Peter. I had known for a while that they were planning to take control of my life in some way, but I had never imagined it would be so direct. The idea that Peter saw me as a burden was difficult to stomach, but it was clear in his behavior, in the way he had offered to help me with the move. Suggesting that I sell the house and move into an assisted living facility. I couldn't deny the sense of dread that washed over me when I thought about it. I decided I needed some time to think, some time to process everything. The house felt suffocating, so I took a drive to a park nearby, one that David and I used to visit on lazy Sunday afternoons. The trees were just beginning to change color, the air crisp and fresh with the promise of fall. As I walked along the path, the weight of my decisions seemed to lighten a bit. The world hadn't stopped just because David was gone. It kept moving, and I needed to keep moving with it. I sat on a bench by the pond, watching the ducks float lazily across the water, and I allowed myself to think. What did I really want? What was I afraid of? It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about my independence, my ability to make decisions for myself without anyone else's influence. I had spent my entire adult life with David, by his side, making decisions together, and now that he was gone, I had to navigate this world on my own. And for the first time in my life, that felt like both a challenge and an opportunity. I thought about Peter's words, about the suggestion to move. On the surface, it sounded like concern, like he was trying to help. But beneath it, I could hear the underlying assumption that I wasn't capable of making my own decisions, that I was somehow fragile. And that wasn't me. That wasn't the woman who had raised him, who had managed a household, a career, and a family. No, I wasn't fragile. If anything, I was stronger than I had ever realized. I also thought about what I wanted for the future. I had always loved to travel, to experience new cultures and ways of life. David and I had talked about taking a big trip after the kids were grown, but we had never gotten around to it. I still remembered the plans we'd made: Paris, the Mediterranean, maybe even Asia. I had dreams that had been put on hold for years, dreams that suddenly felt like they were within my reach. But I hadn't known how to make them happen. Now I realized I didn't have to wait for anyone's permission. I had the resources to do it on my own. When I got back to the house, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the living room. I sat down at the kitchen table, where David and I had shared countless cups of coffee and late-night conversations. The house felt different now, but it still felt like home. I knew I couldn't just walk away from it, but maybe it was time to consider a change. Time to let go of the past and start something new. The next morning, I called Ben. I needed to set up a meeting, not just about the financials, but about the future. I wanted to learn more about my options, about how I could protect myself from Peter's influence, but I also wanted to start planning for my own future, on my own terms. That afternoon, Peter called. His tone was different this time, softer, almost pleading. He said he wanted to come by and talk. I didn't feel ready for another confrontation, but I knew it was inevitable. He had made up his mind about what was best for me, and he wasn't going to let go of that easily. When he arrived, I invited him in, and we sat down at the kitchen table. I could see the concern on his face, the way his eyes flicked nervously between me and the floor. He wasn't as confident as he usually was, and for the first time in a long while, I could see that maybe, just maybe, he was feeling a little unsteady himself. "Mom," he began, "I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I've been thinking about everything, and I don't want to push you into anything, but moving into a smaller place, maybe somewhere easier to manage, could really help you. I just want to make sure you're taken care of." I stared at him for a moment, considering my words carefully. Peter, I know you're concerned, but I'm not ready for that. Not yet. I can take care of myself. I always have, and I don't need anyone making decisions for me. Not even you. His face tightened, and I could see him preparing to argue, but I stopped him before he could speak. I'm not saying no to help, but I'm saying no to being told what I need. You don't get to decide for me anymore. I've been through enough to know that I can handle this on my own. The words hung in the air between us. It wasn't just about the house or the move, it was about my autonomy. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me, not even my own son. The next few weeks felt like a blur of decisions, conversations, and quiet reflection. Peter and Julia's visits became fewer, though I could tell they weren't giving up. They were trying, in their own way, to take care of me, but it didn't feel like care. It felt like control. They had ideas for my life, and none of those ideas seemed to involve me making my own choices. They talked about moving me into an assisted living facility, finding me a smaller house, even suggesting I sell the family home. But I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my son, dictate what my life looked like now. One afternoon, I decided to take a drive, something I hadn't done in a while. The town had changed so much over the years, but as I passed through the familiar streets, I found myself appreciating the memories, not just the places. There was the old bakery where David and I used to stop for fresh bread every Saturday morning, the park where we had picnicked with Lily when she was young, and the library where I spent so many hours volunteering when the kids were small. Everything around me had stories attached to it, stories of laughter, love, and even hardship, but they were my stories. I turned the car down a road I hadn't driven down in years, to a small creek where David and I used to walk on our weekends off. I parked the car by the side of the road and stepped out, feeling the crisp autumn air against my face. The trees were beginning to turn, their leaves a burst of yellow and orange. It was a sight that always made me feel at peace, and I needed that peace now more than ever. I stood by the creek, listening to the gentle flow of water, and let my mind wander. What did I really want? What did my future look like? I had always thought David and I would grow old together, sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the world go by. But now that he was gone, the world felt unfamiliar, and I didn't know where to begin. I had no blueprint for this next phase of my life. But as I stood there, looking at the water, I realized something important. I wasn't starting from nothing. I had a lot more than I had allowed myself to see. David had left me a legacy, not just of wealth, but of freedom. He had made sure I was secure, secure enough to make my own decisions, to travel, to live fully. The thought made my heart swell with a bittersweet kind of gratitude. He had taken care of me even after he was gone, but now it was up to me to decide what to do with it. As I stood there by the creek, I knew what I needed to do. I wasn't going to sell the house. I wasn't going to let anyone tell me what to do with it. This house was full of memories, yes, but it was also my sanctuary. It was a place where I had been loved and where I had loved. It was a place where my life had happened, and I wasn't ready to let go of that just because it might be easier for someone else. But that didn't mean I was going to stay here forever. No, I had other plans. Plans that didn't involve being cooped up in a small, controlled space. It was time for me to live for me, to step outside the boundaries that had once been set by circumstance and start something new. A few days later, I called Ben Marks again. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by all the financial documents David had left behind, and I realized I needed to take the next step. I needed to get more informed about how to handle everything, from taxes to investments to the possibilities for my future. Ben had been there for David through everything, and now he was here for me. I needed to learn how to manage all of this on my own, just like David had trusted me to do. When I met Ben at his office the next morning, I had a clear sense of purpose. I wasn't there just to get the details of David's estate sorted out. I was there to learn how to take full control of my financial life. I needed to empower myself, to understand every aspect of what David had left behind, and to decide what I wanted to do with it. Ben smiled when he saw me walk in. "It's good to see you, Evelyn," he said, leading me to the same room where David and I had sat together all those years ago. "I'm glad you're ready to move forward." I am, I replied, sitting down across from him, feeling a sense of determination that I hadn't felt in weeks. I need to know everything. All of it. Ben opened the folder in front of him and began walking me through the details. David's life insurance policies, his investments, the stocks and bonds he had carefully chosen. There was a lot to absorb, but as Ben explained each part, I felt more confident. It was clear now that David had set up a plan for me, a plan to give me security so that I could make my own decisions, not have to rely on anyone else. David was very meticulous about this, Ben said as we went over the final pieces. He believed in keeping things simple, but also in having options. And Evelyn, you have options. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to follow anyone else's plan for you. It was a strange feeling, hearing Ben tell me that. Up until now, I had thought of myself as someone who needed to be taken care of, especially after David's death. But now, as the numbers and plans all started to come together, I realized something. I was capable. I had the tools I needed. I just had to take the first step. As I left Ben's office that day, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in a long time. I wasn't just dealing with David's death anymore. I was planning for my own future. I was setting my own course. That night, I sat at the kitchen table once again, looking out the window at the darkening sky. The house was quiet, but I felt a renewed sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't just the knowledge of my financial situation, it was the knowledge that I was moving forward. I wasn't stuck. I wasn't being pushed into a life I didn't want. I had choices, and I was going to make them. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of clarity. I had made the decision. I wasn't going to stay here forever, but I wasn't going to let Peter and Julia push me out either. I had plans of my own, plans for adventure, for growth, and for self-discovery. It was time for me to live the life I had always dreamed of, and nothing, not even my son's expectations, was going to stop me. This was my time, and I was ready. The days that followed my meeting with Ben felt like the calm after a storm, but also the beginning of something new, something I hadn't expected, but something that felt right. I spent the next few days sorting through my thoughts and my plans, weighing my options, and feeling more at peace with every decision I made. I knew what I had to do now. I had to let go of the idea that my life had been defined by David, or by Peter, or even by the house. It was time to start over. I decided to take a long weekend to think things through, and I booked a trip to a small bed and breakfast in the mountains. It was the kind of place I'd never been before, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by nature. I needed a change of scenery, a change of pace, and most importantly, I needed the space to think. I left early Friday morning, Lily waving me off from the doorstep with a mix of excitement and concern in her eyes. I reassured her I was just getting some time to myself, but deep down, I was sure she didn't fully understand what I was doing. She was young and still finding her way, and I didn't want to burden her with my own struggles. The drive to the mountains was peaceful, and as I passed through the familiar streets of town, I felt a sense of finality. The house, the memories, and the life I'd shared with David, they were all behind me now. When I finally arrived at the bed and breakfast, I was greeted by the owner, an older woman named Marge, who led me to a cozy room overlooking a quiet forest. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling my lungs, and for the first time in a long time, I felt as if I could breathe freely. I spent the next few days exploring the trails, sitting by the fire with a book, and reflecting on everything that had happened since David's death. It wasn't easy. My mind kept drifting back to Peter and Julia's suggestions, to their desire to control my life, and to the way they tried to push me into a future that wasn't mine. But every time I felt the weight of their words creeping in, I reminded myself of what I had learned in the past weeks. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't fragile. I was strong, and I could handle whatever came next. One afternoon, while I was sitting on a bench by the lake, watching the water glisten in the sunlight, I had an epiphany. It wasn't just about the house or the money or even my independence from Peter. It was about rediscovering myself. I had spent so much time taking care of everyone else, David, the house, the kids, that I had forgotten who I was, what I wanted, and what made me feel alive. I hadn't been living for me. I had been living for the expectations of others. And now it was time to change that. I spent the evening writing in my journal, pouring out everything I had been feeling. I wrote about my fears, my hopes, my dreams that had long been put aside. But most of all, I wrote about my future. What did I want from life? What did I still want to achieve? As I filled the pages with words, I realized that I had more possibilities in front of me than I had ever allowed myself to believe. I could travel, I could volunteer, I could do things I had put off for years. I could finally live for myself. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in ages. It was as if I had peeled away the layers of doubt and fear, and beneath it all, I found a woman who was ready to take on the world. I made the decision that I was going to travel, not as a tourist, not as someone just passing through, but as someone who was truly ready to experience life in its fullest form. I had already set the wheels in motion, contacting a few volunteer organizations, and now it was time to take the plunge. I called Ben from the breakfast table that morning. I was feeling empowered, and I knew I needed to make my intentions clear, not just to him, but to everyone who had been trying to steer me in a direction I didn't want to go. Ben, I'm ready, I said, my voice steady, firm. I want to move forward with the plans. I want to start the process for the international volunteer work, and I want to make sure everything is in place with my finances. I need to get things organized, and I want to make the right decisions for the future. Ben was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear the smile in his voice when he replied. Evelyn, I'm so glad to hear that. David would be proud of you. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thank you, Ben. I'm ready to do this. I'm ready to take control of my life and live it on my terms. I've spent enough time wondering what if. Now it's time for me to do what I've always wanted to do. As the days passed, I kept my mind focused on my goals. I didn't let Peter or Julia's concerns, or their well-meaning but intrusive suggestions, distract me from what I knew I had to do. I called the volunteer organization again, confirming my interest in the program. I started researching destinations and thinking about what I wanted to experience first. Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, they all felt like endless possibilities. When I returned home at the end of the weekend, I felt different. The house was still there, the memories still lingered, but I was no longer shackled to it. I had made my decision, and the future felt full of promise. I no longer saw myself as just a widow, just a mother, just someone waiting for life to happen. I saw myself as someone who could create her own path, someone who could make a difference, not just in my life, but in the lives of others. I didn't know exactly where this journey would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt excited. Excited about the unknown, excited about the possibility of reinventing myself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but that was no longer a fear. It was an opportunity. I knew I had a lot of work ahead of me, papers to file, trips to plan, conversations to have with Peter, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was free, and that was all that mattered. The days after my trip to the mountains felt like a new beginning, though I couldn't quite shake the weight of what still lay ahead. I had made my decisions, but I knew the hardest part was yet to come. Peter and Julia had been quiet since I returned, and I couldn't tell if they were giving me space or if they were preparing for their next move. Either way, I was determined not to let their plans for me dictate my future. I spent my days continuing to sort through the documents Ben had given me, organizing everything I had learned about David's estate and my own finances. The more I dug into it, the clearer it became that David had made every effort to secure my independence. His investments, his life insurance policies, the savings accounts, all of it pointed to one thing: freedom. And I had the freedom to make choices, to live the way I saw fit. I wasn't beholden to anyone's expectations, least of all Peter's. One afternoon, as I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen and saw Peter's name. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't hesitate. I knew I had to face him eventually, and I wasn't going to let him control the narrative any longer. I took a deep breath and answered the call. "Hi, Mom." Peter's voice came through, a little too casual, but I could hear the edge underneath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I think it's time we had a conversation. We need to talk about your plans for the future." I set my tea down, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm listening," I said, bracing myself for whatever he was going to say. I just want to make sure you're okay, you know? Peter continued, his tone still that mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. You've been through a lot, and I think it might be time to think about your living situation. We can help you, Mom. You don't have to do this alone. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I pushed it down. Peter, I've been through a lot. Yes, but I'm not doing this alone. I have the resources. I have the support I need. What I don't need is for you and Julia to make decisions for me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Peter trying to formulate his next words. I just think it's time to be realistic. The house is too big, too much work. You've always been independent, Mom, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed. And I don't want you to be alone. I'm worried about you. I'm not overwhelmed, Peter. I replied firmly. And I'm not alone. I've made my decisions. I'm not going to move into an assisted living facility, and I'm not going to give up my home. I've made it clear that I want to stay here, and I intend to do so. I could sense the frustration building in his voice, though he tried to keep it in check. This isn't about what you want or don't want, Mom. This is about what's best for you. We're just trying to help you. No, Peter, I said, my voice growing stronger. You're not trying to help me. You're trying to control me. You want me to move so you can take over. You want to sell the house, take the inheritance, and move on with your life. But that's not going to happen. This is my life, my home, and my future, and I'm taking charge of it now. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. Then Peter spoke, his voice softer but with a note of anger I hadn't expected. I don't understand, Mom. Why are you being so stubborn about this? Why won't you just let us help you? Because I don't need your help, Peter, I replied, my heart pounding. I don't need to be rescued. I've spent my life taking care of others, making sure everyone around me was okay. But I am not a burden. I am not someone who needs to be fixed. I can handle this on my own. There was a long pause, and for the first time in the conversation, I heard the shift in Peter's tone. You think I don't care about you, don't you? He asked quietly. That I'm just after the money. But that's not it, Mom. I'm just trying to do what's best for you. I want you to be happy. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Peter, I don't think you're doing this out of malice, but I do think you're doing it out of self-interest. I know you and Julia have your own plans, your own ideas about what's best for me, but that's not what I want. I want to live my life, and I want to do it on my own terms. I heard him sigh, a sound of defeat and frustration. I don't know what to say, Mom. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I'm okay, I said softly. I'm more than okay. I'm doing better than I've been in years, because for the first time, I'm making decisions that are mine. I'm not living for you, or for Julia, or for anyone else. I'm living for me. We sat in silence for a moment, neither of us sure of what to say next. Finally, Peter spoke again, his voice small. I don't know if I can accept that, Mom. I understand that, Peter, but this is how it's going to be. I can't keep living my life based on what other people think is best for me, and I won't apologize for that. We ended the call shortly after, and I sat there in the quiet, letting the reality of the conversation settle in. I had finally said it, finally stood my ground, and it felt like a weight had been lifted. But the journey wasn't over yet. Peter might not understand now, but I knew I had to keep moving forward, to keep making decisions that were mine to make. That evening, I took a walk around the yard, the familiar path that David and I had walked so many times before. The trees were beginning to lose their leaves, the ground covered in a blanket of gold and red. I looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. I had made a choice, and I was sticking to it. This was my life, my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. As the night settled in, I knew I was ready. The storm inside me had calmed, and I was standing firm in my decision. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time, I was confident that I was exactly where I needed to be. The days that followed my conversation with Peter were quiet, but I could feel a shift in the air. Something had changed, both in my relationship with my son and within myself. I had drawn a line in the sand, made it clear that I was no longer the passive participant in my own life. Peter and Julia had tried to steer me in one direction, but I had chosen my own path, and though the weight of their disappointment still lingered, I felt relieved. I had stood my ground, and for the first time in a long while, I was living for me. That week, I received an email from one of the volunteer organizations I had reached out to earlier. They had an opening for a program in Kenya, a 3-month assignment with Doctors Without Borders. It was a mobile clinic that traveled to remote villages, providing medical care to people who otherwise had little to no access to health care. I had read about these types of programs before, admired them from afar, but never imagined I could be a part of them. Now, here was my chance, an opportunity to not only travel, but to make a tangible difference in the lives of others. It was exactly the kind of challenge I had been looking for. I read the email twice, trying to absorb the enormity of it. They wanted me to join their team to take on a role managing logistics for the mobile clinic. I had no medical background, but my organizational skills, my ability to manage resources and coordinate teams, would be invaluable. I had spent years managing a household, making things run smoothly behind the scenes. This felt like the perfect fit. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. There were so many unknowns. I didn't know what living in a foreign country for 3 months would be like. I didn't know if I was ready to give up the comfort of home, even for a short time. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was exactly what I needed. It wasn't just about escaping my life. It was about reinventing it, about embracing uncertainty and making it my own. I picked up my phone and called Ben. I needed advice, and I knew he would understand. When he answered, I didn't waste any time. "Ben," I said, my voice firm with a sense of purpose. "I've been offered a position with Doctors Without Borders in Kenya. It's for a 3-month assignment, working with a mobile clinic. They've asked me to manage logistics. I'm thinking of taking it." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Ben spoke. "Evelyn, that sounds incredible. It's an opportunity of a lifetime." "I know," I said, feeling a surge of excitement. "But I'm not sure if I'm making the right decision. It's a big change. Living in a foreign country, working with people I don't know, in an entirely different culture. And then there's everything at home. Peter's still upset, and I'm not sure how to balance all of this." Ben's voice softened. "Evelyn, you've spent so many years taking care of others. Now it's time for you to take care of yourself. This is your chance to do something meaningful, something that could change your life. You've worked hard to get to this point, and you've earned the right to take this step. I think you should go. It's not just about the work. It's about finding yourself again." I sat in silence for a moment, letting his words sink in. Ben was right. This wasn't about running away from my life. It was about embracing a new chapter. I had spent so much of my life making sure everyone else was taken care of, but now it was time to invest in myself, in something that felt true to who I was becoming. "I think I will," I said finally, the words feeling like a promise I was making to myself. "I'm going to do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. I had to get my passport updated, arrange for vaccines, and get the house in order before I left. I didn't tell Peter immediately. I needed to process this on my own before I broke the news. I had always done things for my family, sacrificed my own dreams for their convenience, but now I was doing this for me. I spent hours researching the culture in Kenya, learning about the country's challenges and the incredible work Doctors Without Borders was doing in rural communities. I pored over articles and watched videos about the mobile clinics, about the people who would be depending on our work. The more I learned, the more I knew this was what I had been waiting for. One evening, I sat down and wrote an email to Peter. I knew I had to be honest with him, even if it was difficult. I didn't want him to feel betrayed, but I needed him to understand. Subject: a new beginning. Dear Peter, I hope this email finds you well. I've been thinking a lot lately, and I wanted to share something with you. After a great deal of reflection, I've decided to accept an offer to work with Doctors Without Borders in Kenya. It's a 3-month assignment, working with a mobile clinic in rural villages. It's something I've always wanted to do, and now it feels like the right time to take this step. I know this might come as a surprise, and I understand if you have concerns. But I need you to know that this isn't about running away or avoiding anything. It's about me embracing a new chapter in my life. I've spent many years taking care of others, and now it's time for me to invest in myself, to do something that will bring me meaning and purpose. I hope you can understand my decision. This is something I've thought about deeply, and I know it's the right thing for me. I want you to know that I'm not leaving you or Lily behind. I'm just taking this opportunity to live for me, something I've never done before. I'll keep you updated on everything, and I'm excited to share this experience with you. I hope you can support me in this decision, even if it's hard to understand right now. With love, Mom. I hit send and sat back, the weight of the decision lifting off my shoulders. I didn't know how Peter would react, but I knew it didn't matter anymore. I was living for myself, and that was something I had to own. The next few weeks were a blur of goodbyes, packing, and final preparations. Lily was excited for me, even though she would miss me, and I promised her I would stay in touch as much as I could. I wasn't leaving my family behind, but I was leaving behind the life I had once known. This was my moment to step into the unknown and create a new version of myself. As I stood in the airport, waiting to board the plane that would take me to Nairobi, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer bound by anyone's expectations, no longer living in the shadow of other people's plans. I was about to embark on a journey that would not only change the lives of others, but would redefine my own life. I smiled to myself, ready for whatever came next. The future was mine to create, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. The plane touched down in Nairobi late that evening, and I could feel the excitement bubbling inside me despite the exhaustion from the long flight. The air was warm, and even though it was night, the humidity felt like a promise of something new, something different. I had always imagined what it would be like to travel to Africa, but now that I was finally here, it was hard to process. The city sprawled beneath the runway, a mix of bright lights and shadowy streets, but all I could think about was the mission ahead. I wasn't just here to see the sights. I was here to make a difference. I had signed up for a 3-month assignment with Doctors Without Borders, working in a mobile clinic that would travel to remote villages in the region. The organization was known for its life-changing work, bringing medical care to communities that had little access to health care. It was the kind of work I had admired from a distance for years. But now, here I was, about to dive headfirst into it. My role was to help coordinate the logistics of the clinic, making sure everything from supplies to staffing was in order. It was a huge responsibility, and I wasn't entirely sure what I was getting into, but that's what made it so exciting. I had spent my entire life managing other people's expectations. Now, it was time to manage something that mattered, something that could change lives, starting with my own. The following day, after a much-needed rest at a guest house provided by the organization, I was introduced to the rest of the team. The staff at Doctors Without Borders was an eclectic mix of people from all over the world, each with a unique story. There were doctors, nurses, and logisticians, all coming together for a singular purpose: to provide medical care to those who needed it most. I could feel the energy in the room, a mix of determination and camaraderie. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of belonging, like I was part of something bigger than myself. One of the first things I noticed was the way people talked about their work. They spoke with such passion and urgency, as if every moment mattered. For them, this wasn't just a job, it was a calling. They had all come here for the same reason: to help, to make a difference. And there was no time for hesitation or second guessing. They were on the front lines, seeing the impact of their work firsthand, and they were driven by a sense of purpose I couldn't help but admire. My role was primarily behind the scenes, organizing logistics, arranging transportation for the team, and making sure that supplies were available when and where they were needed. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was crucial. I had spent years managing classrooms, schedules, and budgets, but this was different. Every decision I made here had a direct impact on people's lives. The weight of that responsibility didn't feel heavy. It felt like an honor. As the days passed, we traveled to several villages, some of which were hours away from the nearest hospital or clinic. The roads were often rough, with ruts and rocks that made even the most well-maintained vehicles struggle. But we pushed on because the people we were going to help couldn't afford to wait. I began to understand why this work was so important, not just because the medical care we provided was vital, but because it was urgent. Time wasn't something we could afford to waste. One afternoon, we arrived at a small village nestled in the foothills. The people there greeted us with smiles, though their eyes held a kind of quiet desperation I hadn't expected. We set up the mobile clinic in a community center, and word spread quickly. People began to line up outside, waiting for care. Some had walked for miles, others had arrived by bicycle, but all of them shared one thing in common. They had nowhere else to go. As I watched the medical team work, I couldn't help but be moved by their dedication. They moved swiftly, diagnosing and treating patients with compassion and efficiency. Every moment mattered. A child with a fever was given medicine. An elderly woman with a chronic cough was checked for pneumonia. A young man with a severe infection received antibiotics. In the span of just a few hours, the clinic had treated dozens of people, and every single one of them was grateful, not just for the care they received, but for the fact that we had come, for the fact that they had been seen, heard, and helped. That night, as I sat by the campfire with the rest of the team, I reflected on the day's work. The exhaustion I felt wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. I had seen firsthand how difficult life could be for these people. Many of them had never seen a doctor before, and for some, the care we provided that day was the first time they had been treated with respect and dignity. And I knew, deep down, that this was what I had come here for. This was what I needed, to be a part of something that truly mattered. A few days later, I was sitting with Sarah, a nurse who had been with Doctors Without Borders for several years. She was telling me about her journey, how she had started as a volunteer and worked her way up. I admired her, not just for her medical skills, but for her sense of purpose. It's not always easy, she said, looking out at the horizon. We see a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, but we also see change. We see hope. I looked out at the village, the kids playing in the distance, the adults going about their daily lives, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was what I was meant to do, not just for others, but for myself. I was making a difference, not because of the money I had or the house I lived in, but because I was choosing to live a life of purpose. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give myself. The next few weeks were filled with more clinics, more villages, and more lives touched. I had begun to settle into my role, feeling more confident in the work I was doing and the team I was working with. I had found my place in this strange new world, and I had found myself in the process. The woman who had arrived in Kenya weeks ago, unsure of what the future held, had been replaced by someone who felt more alive than she had in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt a deep sense of peace. I was no longer just a widow, no longer just someone trying to live up to others' expectations. I was a woman with a purpose, a woman who had finally found her own path. And as I looked at the sunset over the African plains, I knew that I had made the right choice. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The weeks in Kenya were a blur of faces, stories, and quiet moments of reflection. Each day brought new challenges, new triumphs, and new lessons that stretched me in ways I never imagined. I had come here with a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose, and though I had always believed that helping others was the key to finding meaning in life, I hadn't expected how much I would learn about myself in the process. The work was grueling, yet incredibly rewarding. Each morning, I would wake early to prepare for the day, checking in with the medical team to make sure the logistics were in place. The clinic, a modest setup housed in a small truck, would be parked in the middle of the village, surrounded by people waiting for the care they desperately needed. There were children with fevers, elderly men and women suffering from chronic illnesses, and entire families who had walked miles to seek help. But despite the overwhelming need, there was always a sense of gratitude in the air, a collective sense of relief that for a brief moment, someone cared enough to show up. As the weeks passed, I began to see the same faces return to our mobile clinics. Some came for routine checkups, others for follow-up treatments, But every time they arrived, there was a quiet recognition that felt like an unspoken connection. In those moments, it wasn't just the doctors and nurses who were providing care, it was all of us, together, sharing in the humanity of it all. We weren't just providing health care, we were offering hope. I could see the difference in their eyes. They weren't just people who needed help, they were people who deserved it, and we were showing them that they mattered. The work had its emotional toll, of course. There were the moments of heartbreak, when a child arrived too late, when a patient's condition had worsened beyond repair, when a mother looked at me with tears in her eyes, knowing there was little we could do. Those were the moments that felt like a punch to the gut, moments that reminded me of the deep fragility of life. But it was also in those moments that I truly understood what it meant to give. To give not just your time, but your heart, your compassion, your willingness to show up, even when the situation felt impossible. One evening, after another long day of treating patients, I sat with Sarah again. We were both exhausted, but there was a contentment that hung between us, a sense of fulfillment that couldn't be put into words. We were sitting by the campfire, the stars above us so bright that it felt like we were part of something much bigger than ourselves. "This is what it's all about, isn't it?" I said, looking out at the firelight. "Seeing the difference we can make." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant, as though she were thinking back on all the years she had spent doing this work. "It's why we keep coming back," she said softly. "It's why we keep showing up, even when it feels like we can't do enough. We don't do it for the glory, Evelyn. We do it because we know what it's like to be on the other side. We've been the ones who needed help, and now we get to be the ones who give it." Her words hit me like a truth I hadn't fully understood until that moment. I had always thought of helping others as an act of charity, a one-way transaction. But now I saw it differently. This wasn't just about giving, it was about sharing in the human experience. It was about being part of something bigger than yourself, something that transcended borders, languages, and backgrounds. The next day, we traveled to another village, one that was located deep in the mountains. The roads were rough, and the drive took hours, but when we finally arrived, the sight that greeted us was both humbling and heartwarming. The community had gathered to meet us, and the children ran toward our trucks with smiles that were uncontaminated by hardship. For a brief moment, it was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from their shoulders. They weren't just looking at us as outsiders. They were looking at us as partners, as people who cared enough to take the time to come to them. We set up the clinic in the shade of a large tree, and within minutes, people began lining up. There were so many: families, individuals, elderly people, and children, each with their own story, each carrying their own struggles. I watched as the doctors worked tirelessly, providing care and comfort where they could. As I moved around, helping coordinate supplies and ensure everything was running smoothly, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the sheer humanity of it all. Every life in front of me, every person waiting for help, represented something bigger than just a medical need. They represented hope. They represented survival. They represented the best and worst of what it meant to be human. That evening, as the last patient was seen and the clinic was packed up, I found myself standing by the truck, watching the people begin to leave. Some walked away with prescriptions, some with a smile, some with nothing more than the knowledge that they had been seen. A few of the children had drawn pictures for the team, tiny scribbles that, to them, represented a huge gesture of thanks. It was in that moment, watching those children smile, that I realized what this work was really about. It wasn't just about fixing people. It was about giving them something to hold on to, something to carry with them even when we weren't there. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I felt something stirring inside me. It wasn't just pride in the work we had done. It was a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. This was what I had been searching for all along. This was why I had made the decision to leave behind everything I knew, why I had stepped out of my comfort zone and into something that was so much bigger than myself. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I was making an impact, not just on the people I helped, but on myself as well. Later that night, I sat outside, the cool air of the African night wrapping around me like a blanket. I thought about how far I had come. From the woman who had stood in that quiet house in Iowa, unsure of what to do with her life, to the woman sitting here now, ready to take on the world. It had been a journey, one that was still unfolding, but I knew one thing for certain. I was exactly where I was meant to be. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I wasn't just someone who had been defined by the past. I was Evelyn Carter, a woman who had chosen to live her life with purpose, with courage, and with the understanding that every step I took was part of a bigger story. And this, I realized, was just the beginning. The weeks seemed to blur together as I settled into the rhythm of life here in Kenya. The days were long, the work was demanding, and yet I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Every morning, we would set up the clinic, organize our supplies, and begin seeing patients, one after the other, hour after hour. There was always someone waiting, always someone in need, and though the work was exhausting, there was something profoundly fulfilling about being able to provide for them, to offer something more than just medical care. We were offering hope, something that, in the places we visited, was often in short supply. What struck me most about the work here wasn't just the need, it was the resilience of the people. Despite the hardships they faced, poverty, illness, lack of basic services, there was an undeniable strength in their spirit. I saw it in the way they greeted us, in the way they cared for one another, in the way they stood tall even in the face of adversity. In the Western world, we often take so much for granted: access to healthcare, education, food, clean water. Here, every small thing seemed like a luxury. And yet the people I met were far richer in resilience and grace than many I knew back home. One afternoon, while we were treating a group of women from a nearby village, I had a conversation with one of the doctors, Dr. Akila, who had been working with Doctors Without Borders for over 5 years. She was a Kenyan native, and I admired her not just for her medical expertise, but for the way she connected with her patients. She had a way of making people feel seen, even in their most vulnerable moments. "You know, Evelyn," she said as we sat together during a break, "when I first started working here, I didn't realize how much I would be changed by the people I was trying to help. I thought I was just here to fix things, to make a difference in their lives. But the truth is, they make a difference in mine every day." I looked at her, surprised by the raw honesty in her words. "How do they do that?" I asked, genuinely curious. Dr. Akila smiled softly, her eyes distant. "They remind me of what's truly important: human connection. It's easy to get caught up in the rush of our own lives, in the little frustrations, the things that feel like problems back home. But when you see people who have so little, and yet they are still grateful for every moment, you start to realize that we have so much to be thankful for." Her words resonated deeply within me. I had come to Kenya thinking I was here to give, to offer help, but in truth, I was learning far more than I could ever give in return. The people I met here had taught me more about gratitude, about what it means to live fully, even when life is anything but easy. They had shown me what it meant to appreciate the little things, the things I had taken for granted for so many years. The days passed, and my sense of purpose grew clearer. I had come to Kenya thinking I was doing this work for others, but somewhere along the way, I realized I was doing it for myself as well. I had spent so many years focused on other people's needs: David's, the kids, everyone else's. But now, I was finally living for me. This wasn't just about finding a cause to dedicate myself to. It was about rediscovering who I was, beyond the roles I had played for so many years. I knew now that I didn't need the validation of others to feel worthy. I didn't need to prove anything to Peter, to Julia, or to anyone else. My worth wasn't tied to the house I lived in or the expectations others had of me. My worth was found in my actions, in the choices I made, in the way I showed up in the world. One morning, I received a message from Peter. It had been a while since we had spoken, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I opened the message with a sense of hesitation. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything. I'm sorry if I pushed you too hard. I just wanted what I thought was best for you, but I realize now that I've been trying to control things, and that's not fair to you. I should have respected your decision more. I miss you, and I hope you're doing well. I hope we can talk soon." I sat there for a moment, the phone in my hands, absorbing the weight of his words. For the first time, I saw the vulnerability in his message. It wasn't just an apology, it was an admission that he had been wrong. It was an acknowledgement that he had underestimated me, and I could tell that it had shaken him. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to think about it. But that evening, I decided to call him. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. We talked for over an hour about the things we hadn't said, about the space that had grown between us, and about what it meant to move forward. There were still so many unresolved feelings, but as we talked, I felt a sense of reconciliation growing between us. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I don't know if I'll ever understand completely, Peter said quietly toward the end of the conversation. But I respect your choices, Mom. I think you're doing something incredible, and I'm proud of you. I felt a lump form in my throat. For so long, I had craved his approval, his understanding, and now I had it, not just from him, but from myself. I had finally accepted that my value didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. It was enough to know I was doing the right thing for me. A few weeks later, I stood at the edge of a small village, looking out over the vast horizon, the sun setting behind the mountains. The clinic had been set up for the day, and we had just finished seeing the last group of patients. It had been a long, exhausting day, but there was a sense of fulfillment that lingered in the air. I felt it in my bones, in the quiet hum of the evening. This was what it meant to live with purpose, to be fully present in a way that transcended the daily grind of life. In that moment, I realized how far I had come. I had left behind a life defined by expectations and fear, and now I was living a life full of possibility, full of meaning. I wasn't just surviving, I was truly alive. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, savoring the cool breeze that swept across the land. It had been a long journey, but I had finally found the strength to walk my own path. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I was headed. Life has a way of challenging us, often in ways we least expect. One of the most valuable lessons I've learned is that true freedom comes from owning your decisions, no matter how difficult they may seem. Don't wait for approval or permission from others to pursue what feels right for you. It's easy to get caught up in the expectations of family, friends, or society, but the most important relationship you'll ever have is with yourself. Take time to listen to your own desires, fears, and aspirations. Life is too short to live based on someone else's idea of success. Embrace uncertainty because that's often where growth happens. It's okay to be vulnerable, to acknowledge your mistakes, and to course correct along the way. Don't be afraid to reinvent yourself, to take risks, and to choose a path that aligns with your heart, even if it's different from what others expect. True peace comes when you stop seeking approval and start living for yourself. Embrace the discomfort of change and trust that you are capable of handling whatever life throws your way. The journey to self-fulfillment begins with the courage to trust yourself.